Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the October Public Board meeting of the CQC. We have an apology for absence from Lewis Appleby, who is not well. Other than that, I think we're all here, or will be when people come back in the room anyway. Are there any interests that anybody needs to declare? Excellent. So, moving swiftly on, minutes of the meeting that we had on 13th of September, are they a true and accurate record of everything we discussed? Good. Okay, those are approved. I think for the first time since I've been here, there is nothing on the action log. We are so efficient and up to date. Was there anything arising that anybody wanted to raise that isn't otherwise on the agenda? Perfect. So we go straight to the Chief Executive's report. David.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. I'll do this in two parts. Part one is the performance report, and part two are some briefings and updates. So I'll come back to that in laterally. On the performance report, I think we're trying to adopt a convention of where Kate will speak about financial performance, and then the Chief Inspectors will talk about individual performance. So I'm not going to present this, Peter. If I invite Kate just to take us through where we are in relation to financial performance, and then I think each of my colleagues will pick up the other performance.
Thanks, David. So this presents the figures as at the end of August. So in the month of August, we continue to underspend on both pay and non-pay, bringing the cumulative underspend to 3.7 million. We do have a shortfall in income of 800,000, so the net underspend at the end of August was 2.9 million. The Directorate forecast suggests that we will have a year-end underspend of 10.2 million, although the current run rate would suggest a higher forecast underspend, but we do know that there's quite a lot of recruitment and activity expected in the second half of the year that will increase expenditure. So, that's anything else.
Thank you, Kate. Any questions for Kate on that before we move on? Gosh, your lucky day, Kate. Oh, no, sorry, I thought you were flagging that you wanted to raise a question. Sorry, no. Got kicked under the table from Kate, obviously. Right, David, you want to go to the Chief Inspectors, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So where are we starting?
I'll go.
Go on then, Steve.
Well, it gives me the chance to say something positive, which is really good. So on the performance, I just want to congratulate publicly my teams across the country, because the average days to publish reports has dropped considerably to 28 days. And we've been criticised for the last few years on our timeliness of publication. Part of that as a sort of rolling figure is because we have some held up legally, and certainly we had a problem with recruitment in some areas. We're now fully recruited to all of our inspector places, jobs. They've introduced lean management into the systems, and to get down to 28 days for general practice and dentistry, I think is a great achievement, and I just wanted to say well done to the teams and report that to you.
I think we would echo that. That's really great news. Thank you. So, Ted, how are you doing?
This report covers the time when we started our first inspections under the next phase methodology. That was in August, and that's reflected in some of the activity figures you see, because they started in the middle of August, so it's about half a month's activity there. And that has been progressing well, and there's more detail of some of the inspection work in the text of the report as well. In terms of report timeliness, which Steve was just talking about, we've been making progress on that, and the average number of days to publication is now falling. It's fallen since this report, and it continues to fall month on month. We're still not within the KPIs, and we have more work to do, and we're focusing heavily on that. As we introduce the new report structure under the next phase methodology, we expect that to improve markedly.
Okay, any questions for Ted? So, over to Andrea.
Thank you. Just a few things to highlight. The first is on slide 3, looking at the registration processes and the continued improvement that we have there of completing the decisions on registration within 50 days, which is our key performance indicator target. And I think that the continued improvement there is also building on the improvement that we've seen from our colleagues in NCSE in terms of passing on the registration applications through to the registration team to deal with. So in both NCSE and in registration, there's been some very good work. And again, I'd echo Steve's wish to pay tribute to staff in doing that and seeing that improvement. The next slide that I wanted to take you to was slide 6, which looks at the productivity and the activity that we've got there. We had a slight dip of productivity in August, and that was largely to do with absences. Obviously, it's the height of summer holidays for people in August, and we are not in the position that Steve is in terms of having all vacancies recruited to have a high level of turnover, and we've also got a high level of sickness in adult social care, which is reflected in the fact that only 85% of our inspections in terms of going back when we said that we, within the timescales that we said that we would, rather than at 90%. And we have been working on that, looking at the forward planning for our recruitment, also trying to forward plan on our recruitment so that where we know that people are intending to leave because of retirement dates coming up, that sort of thing, that we are recruiting ahead of time so that we don't have huge gaps, because of course once you've got people in, you've got to train them as well, so it's not like people start on the first day able to pick up a level of activity that their colleagues who have been with us for longer can. The recovery plans that the local teams have been developing will help us to improve our position, but we're still very anxious about that towards the end of the year, and we don't think that we'll get to the key performance indicator target of 90% by the end of the year, unfortunately. But I do again have to say that the teams are working under quite considerable pressure. You can see that in terms of the increase in the numbers of enforcement actions that are ongoing and the activity that they're undertaking there. So people are working extremely hard, but it is a worry for me in terms of how we're responding to the timeliness of inspections, because what we're really concentrating on is responding to risk. And you can see that when you look at slide 7, and these were figures that we reflected in the State of Care report last week, which is that of the good services that we're going back to, and an awful lot of the early services that we're going back to are because people are sharing with us concerns about services, so we are responding to those. But you can see that 23% of services that we've gone back to that we'd previously rated as good are deteriorating, 20% to requires improvement and 3% to inadequate. And I think that the message that we shared last week about services being precarious is really reflected in that, and is something that we've got to be on top of in being able to respond to people highlighting risk to us. And again, on report writing, which is what Steve started us off with, we continue to drop the average number of days, and we're at 34 now, and also kind of keeping ourselves approaching to the 90% key performance indicator target, and we're at 86% now. So again, really good work from the teams to try and achieve that.
So there's a lot of positive news in what you've just said, and I echo your sort of congratulations to your people who are working under huge pressure and delivering. But the worry, which you yourself said, is around staffing levels. And given that we know the whole sector is under real staffing issues, I mean, how optimistic can we be about getting up to full strength and staying there, do you think?
We are having a positive response to recruitment. The difficulty for us is keeping pace with the level of turnover and recruitment, and actually making sure that we're running sufficient numbers of assessment centres, which obviously involve inspection managers and as well as the recruitment teams to support. So it's really making sure that we're keeping up to date with all of that. We do have some particular hotspots of worry, which is in the south, which is, coincidentally, perhaps not so coincidentally, where we also see kind of significant challenges in terms of recruitment in the adult social care sector as well. But it's something that we are trying to keep on top of, and working with Eileen's team and the People Directorate to make sure that we're doing that as proactively as we possibly can. Team are also looking at how we can introduce more of a skill mix into adult social care. So we have been looking at the introduction of assistant inspector posts, which have been very successfully used in the other directorates, and we've had some good positive responses to those recruitments as well. But it's just relentless, really, in terms of keeping going with it.
Thanks. Any questions? Steve?
Just to add to Andrea's point, I think the assistant inspector's post, including in the medicines management team, pharmacists have been hugely successful. And particularly I met with the senior team in medicines optimisation management this week. And a number of theirs are now ready to become inspectors and are applying for those jobs. And I think the fact we took that initiative has been really good. I mean, we are at our best recruitment than we've been. Our turnover has gone up slightly because a number of ours are now getting promotion across CQC, which is really good. And I think schemes like that have been hugely helpful, not just for us, but across the board.
Thanks. Eileen, this is your last board meeting. So we can't let it pass without giving you a chance to talk about some of the great stuff that's been going on in NCSC.
Well, thank you, Peter. So it is a great note to end on to actually celebrate the fact that if you look at the NCSC performance, where actually people are not just performing against targets they had previously, they're actually exceeding the performance that we set before we set out to modernise our customer service centre. So it has been a huge team effort. I think Tracy Forrester has done an amazing leadership job up there, and she's playing a part with Andrea in the reworking of registrations. So it really does show CQC at its best, a genuine team coming together with all the skills to make sure that end-to-end we are as good as we can be. So I think celebrating that. Also, I think thanking people such as our recruitment team, if I just indulge me to actually mention them, because they are having completed what feels an age ago, what we call Project 600, which actually turned into Project 800, which was the recruitment of our core staffing. We're now at that point where actually people who've been with us for 2 or 3 years are choosing to go to other places, and that's entirely normal. Does mean for our recruitment team, though, that they are back out on the road looking for people to come to us and making sure they've got the right skills and motivations. And I think they are doing a good job on that, but they are slightly background, unsung hero type people. So the indulgence bit is to say thank you very much to them as well.
So I'm sure that you had absolutely nothing to do with any of the improvement that's taking place, but just in case you did, can I just thank you as well? Eileen, having said all that, and it really is a stunningly good performance, but there are a couple where we're still not hitting the KPIs. Some of the safeguarding around requiring mandatory action, for example. Are we confident that the trajectory continues? Because the trajectory is coming up. Are we confident that it continues and we will hit the KPI?
I am very confident it will do, but around safeguarding and mandatory actions in particular, this is where CQC, in order to hit the KPI, it is more than NCSC that needs to do something. And occasionally it is the recording once they've handed it on to an inspection colleague, which is causing that a particular KPI not to be hit. So I think what we're looking at is the component parts of those actions, and to make sure that everybody is actually clear about what they need to do.
So if I said you're not allowed to leave until this has hit the target, you would say, yeah.
I would say that education's need is greater at the moment, so I'm off, I'm afraid, Peter. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, seriously, there's some really, really good performance, and I would just want to congratulate everybody on that. David, back to you, I think.
Okay.
So sorry, Paul.
Could I ask one, or make one? Apologies. I was looking at slide 8 and enforcement's in progress. And it's sort of Rebecca's area, I think, partly anyway. It's quite noticeable there that there are 818 criminal actions where we're in progress. And this sort of reflects back, because I imagine quite a lot of those are in the adult social care area. You would have seen in the minutes of the ACGC meeting that we had an update from Rebecca on this. There's an awful lot of volume that's coming through in the enforcement's area, there's a big hopper of stuff which actually then has to be triaged down in some fashion to get to where are we actually confident that enforcement actions will have the right thing to do and will have the right effect. That in turn has an effect on adult social care inspectors who are involved in the accumulation of evidence and so on around that. So I think Rebecca was telling us that there's some work being done to look at how we can streamline that to get that to be more efficient in there, so that we get the right number of, well, not the right number, we get the right cases through to the actions that need to be taken as quickly as possible. We were suggesting in ACGC that that's something that Lewis isn't here, but that RGC might look at the proposals around that to make sure that they're the right ones from the board's perspective around that. But there is something about that number and the way it's impacting upon ASC inspectors.
Well, I'm all in favour of putting follow-up actions on somebody who isn't here, so that's fine. So we'll make sure that Lewis knows that, seriously, I think it's exactly the right thing to do. Do you want to add anything, Rebecca, on that, or Andrea?
Well, just to sort of say it is something that I've begun to have conversations about. And in fact, I had a meeting with my counterpart at HSE yesterday, and we were talking about how HSE manage their sort of selection criteria, and that there are some key differences, but there are also things that I'm sure we can learn. So I think there's quite a lot of hopefully fairly rapid progress we can make, and then perhaps some longer term stuff which will build as we get more experienced. But I would certainly hope to have some strands of work going through the Enforcement Oversight Board, through the working group, and up to Andrea and ET and RGC relatively quickly.
Andrea?
Yes, just to say two things. One is that Rebecca has referred to the Enforcement Oversight Board, which is led by Debbie Westhead, who is one of the Deputy Chief Inspectors in adult social care, but she takes that lead across the whole organisation. And they are looking with Rebecca and the rest of the legal team as well at what are those criteria, making sure that they're fully understood and that we're informing the training and support that inspectors have and their managers have, because they're crucial in the decision-making process for this as well. And the second thing to say is that I'm equally concerned about the big hopper, as Paul has described it, of all of those cases sitting there and people worrying away at them and collecting more evidence and checking things, and actually, where should we be focusing the effort in terms of these are truly going to be cases that we will be taking forward, that there is a case to answer, and that we've got the evidential basis to do that, and there is a public interest test to address as well. So one of the things that we're doing within adult social care is really to get all of those cases reviewed at a more senior level to absolutely make sure that we're doing the right thing, and that we're taking forward the cases that we can, and that where we don't have the basis to take that forward, that we've got a good rationale and explanation as to why not, which includes if those have obviously impacted on individuals, and we have contact with their families or themselves, then that we would be talking with them as well.
Good. All right. Thank you. David, it is now back to you.
So, the remainder of this report is about updates on things that have already happened in the main. So, I draw attention in paragraph 2 to the publications that we've had over the past few weeks. The State of Hospices report, quality and place reports of both Sutton and Cornwall, the local systems reviews, which Steve referred to in the earlier meeting, are all referenced there, and I think make a significant contribution to the way that the system is operating, as distinct from what's in paragraph 3, which is a brief update from Ted's team in relation to inspections completed on trusts since the last meeting. I don't want to gloss over those reports, and in the spirit of paying tribute to staff, I'd just like to do this to the editorial staff. These are the guys who sit there and knock this out, turn it into plain English, design it, get the pictures to make sure whether it's digitally available on a website or a print version. It is of a standard of production and presentation which is accessible, and Ian Dodds and his team, I think, do fantastic work. But I think the reports also say something quite profound and quite important in relation to the way that the system's operating at the present time. Paragraph 4 is just an update on the General Data Protection Regulation, and just alerting the board that work is going on to prepare for the implementation of these regulations next year. This is the first opportunity, I think, for the board to consider the State of Care report since we published it last week. There's a brief synopsis of what we said, and the last paragraph is commenting on the reception that it got from stakeholders and journalists. I think there was a lot of support for it both on the day and then subsequently, I think, in terms of the richness of the document and the richness of the information that sits behind some of those headline messages. It's been both described as subversive by one person and rich by the other. I'll leave you to work out where on that continuum you want to sit in terms of the volumes of information in there. But I have to say, I think it was the most complete report that we've published over the past 5 years, just because of its breadth of coverage and the confidence we can have in the data that's sat in that. And a big congratulations to everybody across the organisation for that. And the other thing that happened at the back end of last week was the completion of the review by the National Audit Office of our performance. And on the 13th of October, the Auditor and Comptroller General published his report commenting that we're an improved organisation, value for money is improving, and if we continue in our current direction we can secure further improvements. And he flagged a conversation we're going to have later this morning, colleagues, in relation to digital systems and capability and intelligence-driven risk-based approach to regulation as being key for the future. So I think it was affirming that he reflected the direction of travel that we've set out in the strategy is one that he endorses. My personal view of this report is I think it was a fair assessment of where we are, rightly congratulating the progress we've made and rightly challenging us to go further. And I think all of us that are scrutinised by external bodies, and we do this to others, want the reports to be fair. And my view is that this was. So what will happen next is we'll bring back a response to the recommendations to the December meeting of the board. And we'll have more detailed discussions at Audit and Corporate Governance Committee under Paul's chairmanship on the progress we're making on that during the new year. It may well be that we have a Public Accounts Committee hearing. I don't know whether they'll see this as a priority given everything else we need to be doing over this next period, but one can anticipate that they will. So I think that work is important if there's a spring Public Accounts Committee hearing, that we are clear about what our response is and how we're going to take it forward. Paragraph 7 is an impending publication of the Children and Young Persons Mental Health Service. We've given some signal about the report's availability and some of the content in here. I think there might be a slight revision to our plans to publish this from the 19th. I think it may well end up being on the 23rd or the 24th next week, in the way that this works out. And I think yesterday we were invited to give evidence to a Health Select Committee, which is due to consider child and adolescent mental health on the 21st of November. So I think Paul Elliott will take the lead and represent us at that Select Committee on the 21st. So this is a hot topic. And then the last update is just to say that the Bermuda Health Council, which is going to be the body that regulates health and care services in Bermuda, have been over part of an exchange, and there's been a training programme provided by the Academy for the people that will be doing their inspections, so they can actually benefit from the experience and the learning that we've had as well. So that's the report, Peter. So I think lots of positive progress in that.
I agree. Lots in there, and lots of it positive. Is there anything anybody wants to raise or ask? Right. Your lucky day, David. Right, yeah. So is Helen out there, Malta? Welcome. We've surprised you by actually being ahead of schedule for once, but well done for being out there. So I'm very impressed. Your intelligence was working well, Helen. Malta, do you want to introduce this?
Thank you very much. Well, so to introduce Helen Lawrence, our Director of Intelligence, and Paul Williamson, our User Voice Development Manager, and our Qualitative Analysis team who has been leading this piece of work, and just to invite Paul to give a brief introduction on the paper that sets out the direction we want to take on our patient experience survey programme, and ask the board for your steer and agreement on the strategic direction to take over the next few years so that we can go ahead with the conversations around future procurement next year. Thank you. Paul, over to you.
It consists of the 5 national statistics that CQC produces, and it's part of a survey programme that is operated across DH and NHS England, collecting patients' experiences on a range of care, predominantly here at CQC around acute care, but that also includes community mental health services as well. The programme itself is based on a highly repeatable and robust method which allows us to compare organisations and areas which other collections around patient experience, so things like the Friends and Family Test or individual interviews, focus groups, things of that kind, won't easily do. So it gives us a specific data source that we can use as part of our insight products, but across health and social care system to use for their various dashboards and metrics that support continuing improvement. The presentation that is here talks about continuing the development of that programme in a way that we have already begun to do so increasing sampling size, breaking it down and making it of more value, so squeezing the juice out of what we got, but then doing 3 other things in effect. The move generally towards a greater level of digital communication across the NHS system means that email addresses are more routinely collected, and a vision of a 2020 paperless system will push it further into that direction, meaning that I could, instead of send out paper questionnaires, reduce the costs for NHS organisations, put that through a digital format and collect the information quicker and much cheaper for trusts. So switching to a more digital system, continuing to be supported where necessary with paper for harder to reach groups, allows us to do that. The second thing that is also true is that new care models are beginning to develop, and as they do so, people's experiences of those will be key for us to understand. And I want to be able to pilot approaches into looking at what that experience looks like, how I can collect it, where the samples would come from, and the kinds of questions that would be useful for us to understand quality in those contexts. That's a bit further off, but it would certainly come within the period in which this contract is talking about. Then the final thing is that because a digital system is inherently more flexible, you can put together questionnaires more quickly because they will be naturally shorter because they need to be digital. You are able to send them out more routinely and on a range of topics that we currently don't cover because they are not increasing the cost to the service in itself. What that means is that we'll be able to revisit the actual flow of that data, so we can increase it potentially towards a more annual cycle to help us in the next phase. But also we'll be able to undertake pulse checks where we have questions that we want to be able to understand people's experiences about rather quickly. So the basis of this paper is to continue that programme and continue its development, but also specifically to look at development within the next 5 years in those 3 areas.
Paul, thank you. That's a really clear explanation, and it seems to me that the summary is that by going down this route we get a lot more for quite a lot less, which is a good place to be. Anybody want to? Robert?
Likewise, I thought this is a very clear presentation, and thank you, and clearly it persuades me that we need to continue this extremely valuable work. One note of caution I would have, which I'm sure is intended but I don't see mentioned, is that while of course the majority, even of people of my age, are accessible by digital means, the most vulnerable parts of our population tend not to be. So if we're talking about the patient experience of the elderly, some of those who live in economically deprived circumstances or have special needs, we still need to have, I imagine, a programme that accesses them on a regular basis, so they are treated equally as the rest of the population. And I just wonder how that's factored into the programme.
So I absolutely agree with you. The current take-up around email addresses is around 70 to 80%, and that, for obvious reasons, continues to increase. But that does mean, in particular, for a much older population, that email addresses just simply isn't an option. For now, we wouldn't switch to a purely digital system. We would need to leave in place the telephone helplines to allow people to call and respond over the phone, paper methods which we can also use and send, and because the sample data collects a range of biographical data as well as email addresses, we'll be able to target those where they need to be. We wouldn't rush to a purely digital solution straight away. We'd need to leave in a mixed methods until then.
Steve.
Thanks. It was an excellent presentation, and I think the paper is very clear. It's just to highlight an issue. So I'm pleased that we're looking at the what are called new models of care, but many aren't new models of care. They're existing ones done slightly differently, they're not new. And it's to clarify that NHS England managed the GP patient survey, which we rely on quite heavily, and probably don't have the impact on its development that we probably should have. Going forward, with that being based in one organisation and this being based in another, it's vitally important that we get the opportunity to talk across both. I'm still not convinced that GP surgeries that are owned by a hospital don't fall within NHS England's patient survey. So I'd like clarification sometime on that. For example, Yeovil Hospital will have 12, 14 GP surgeries. The other surgeries in Yeovil will be freestanding surgeries or organised and owned by other organisations. It would be extremely useful for us and helpful in our rating for the same questions to be asked of both groups of surgeries so that we can compare across Yeovil, let alone across the whole of England. So I support the paper, but the anomaly of the two surveys being in isolation when GP surgeries will be owned by and run by different organisations means that we're still behind the times on where the NHS is going. Thank you.
Steve, I'm just declaring my former interest in Yeovil, but I'm not sure that the ownership is the issue. These are not primary care services provided within the acute trust in quite that way. I mean, they are still provided through a GP practice, which is on a contract. So why would they not be in the?
So I'm highlighting a potential anomaly, but in a bigger anomaly, in that some surveys we lead on and other NHS organisations lead on others. And if they're not joined up, when you're out there, as we talked about last night when we were talking about, for example, Dudley and Kent, the NHS is moving faster than we are collectively with our surveys and things, and we just need to make sure that we keep on top of it. Because if we're not going to look at similar data across the whole of the NHS, it's very difficult then to rate. So it's just I've got absolute confidence in Paul and Helen. I'm just highlighting it as a potential issue.
So there is something of interest. So we do sit on the boards of the two major surveys that we also use, so the GP patient survey plus the NHS staff survey. If I can at all get myself on the ASCOF survey, I'd be squeezing myself through the door, I can assure you. The development of that, therefore, we do have some say over, but we don't have control. And I think retaining control of these surveys gives us a greater ability to develop them to our needs. And that is absolutely a point. The other thing which I think is true is that the GP patient survey is a population survey. The area of influence we could therefore have is the reporting out. So the population in those areas in Yeovil or other, where the service models are slightly different, their view is still being collected, but the reporting is done at a GP patient level because it's done at the GP survey. And if we could influence that decision, then we could get the data that you're looking for more easily. But we wouldn't need to change the collections.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Good, thank you. Ted?
Yes, just strong support for this work. I think these surveys have been really very valuable to us, both in deciding where to inspect in our new risk-based methodology, but also in our inspection reports. And they're quoted heavily, heavily in our inspection reports as a reflection of the patient experience in the services we inspect. And I think as we move towards a more annual cycle of inspections, I'm very keen to see the frequency increase. And of course, the digital approach that you're talking about will help us do that. So we have up-to-date information, because some of these reports are only done over 2 years, and yet if we're inspecting every year, we want up-to-date information. So I strongly support this direction of travel. Can I just highlight for the board that yesterday we reported the latest survey on emergency departments, where we reported the responses of 45,000 patients who've been recently in emergency departments. And I have to say it was really very important insight into the experience of patients in emergency departments, in which we know are working under enormous pressure at the moment. And the overall response from patients was, I think 67% of patients said they rated their experience very well, which I think is encouraging when the system is under so much pressure.
Thanks, Ted. And yeah, Jora.
Just a question. When you go from, say, paper to digital, the type of questions asked on paper are quite long form, and people using these things, it's a lot harder to see that length. Is there any change in the way we're going to hold the service so it does take advantage of mobile devices?
Absolutely. So there are a few things that you need to do. You need to revisit the website so that you have all of the material held on. You need to also revisit the way that it's accessible. So no one really uses a computer anymore to fill a survey in. They're much more likely to use a tablet or your phone. So we would need to revisit those decisions as well. The other thing that is absolutely true, and we will need to get this right across the system, is that you will need a much shorter questionnaire. I'd love you to fill in a 70-page questionnaire on your phone, but you're not going to do it. So we will need to work with our system partners to work out what are the absolute key questions that we need to be asking routinely, and what are those key questions that we want to be using on a pulse base to work out what do I need to ask in winter, for example, and time that. But there is a technology shift that needs to happen over that period, and we'll be looking at that as well.
So I think, Paul, as Simon Cowell would say, you've got 4 yeses and a board approval to the strategy, which is fantastic. And thank you very much. That's a really good, clear presentation. So thanks.
Thank you.
Good. Right. We move on. So, Paul, I think we move to you and the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee, please.
done it again. Routine meeting of ACGC. On management assurance, this is the process by which management looks internally and does peer reviews internally on our processes to try and assess how we're doing, and we use a similar sort of process of rating things as we do on our inspections. This has proved to be actually a very good process of being transparent about what we're doing, how we're doing, and has been applied well. It's been looked at by internal audit to some extent. It's been looked at by, as I say, through peer reviews, and I am really encouraged by how positive people have been in applying this, and honest they've been in applying this. It's been very helpful to management, I think, in terms of directions of travel and so on. The question we had was whether this needs to change in some way, having been in place for a couple of years. The answer is yes, probably it does. But what we're going to do is pilot some of the changes in this process over the next period, the next 6 months or so, and we'll stay with the old process for the full management assurance process, so that we've got something which we can benchmark against previous years. And ACGC were happy with that approach, and we'll go forward on that. The risk register, as you can see, we looked at 3 different risks there. I think the one which we probably spent more time on was the IT technology and systems, and we've got a presentation coming up on IT and systems and technology and digital next. And we also inquired into the areas of the high-performing culture and what is it we need to do in order to be able to drive the high-performing culture more into the organisation. And very much focused on leadership within that. We know that leadership is important both within our own organisation, but in the organisations we inspect and rate. And I think that the stage we're at now is actually driving leadership down into the organisation. It's not an executive leadership team, it's actually the next sort of 500 or 600 people below that, in a sense. And they're at the Ashridge, it is Ashridge, isn't it? Ashridge programme that we've got and how that's coming through. So I think ACGC were encouraged by what came through in terms of how we're doing that. Obviously, this is a hard one. This is it's both education and culture, and it's something which needs to be worked at in detail, and it's hard yards to get. But I think we've got progress coming there. We'll see the results of that over the next year. And we looked at the risk around essentially market oversight, and we're happy that risk is well mitigated. Internal audit progress, some reports issued, no limited assurance opinions in there, which is a great result compared to where we've been a few years ago. I think that the internal audit progress is moving forward, and nothing particular to report there. Strategic implementation plan, this was an audit report we've done previously, where some points have been raised about what we were doing around engagement and so on, and that engagement internally, and so on around that. And we had a report on the progress on dealing with the points which have been raised, which was good. Pensions governance, we could spend a long time on pensions governance. We did spend a long time on pensions governance within the ACGC. This was looking at those of our staff who are members of pension schemes that are local authority pension schemes. And there are over 500 of those individuals, so it's quite a number. The majority of those, large majority of those, are in the Teesside scheme, and then you've got about 15 other schemes where we have small numbers of staff who are members of those schemes, and it's all for historic reasons, essentially. We were looking at what our role is in the governance processes there, and our role is a bit remote in that, because obviously the governance process for the schemes themselves is with the local authority schemes and with the local authority and with the trustees of those schemes. But what we were looking at is our kind of role within that, whether we understand enough about what evidence is available that those schemes are okay in terms of their administration and their financial position, and what might be specific things for us around decisions we might need to take. And there's one interesting bit, which is that when we end up with no members of a scheme where we've previously had members, there is a charge which comes through, which is a reflection of any obligations which have not yet been included in contributions that we've made. It's about deficits on schemes, essentially, and how at a point that your last person goes out the door, suddenly the deficit falls in, and you have to make a contribution quite quickly as a result of that. Any one scheme is not a huge amount of money. Add them all together, and there's a certain amount of money that's involved in that. So we just need to make sure that we understand when those are most likely to fall in, and that depends upon people retiring often rather than anything else. It could also because people move elsewhere. And that we are lined up with DH in terms of, because DH have the ultimate responsibility, because they've given us guarantees on these schemes, that DH understand when those amounts are going to fall in. It's not huge amounts of money, but it's just something we need to keep under it. So we did that work as part of ACGC, and I think we can now hand that responsibility over to the Finance Committee to follow through on. It was a good piece of work done by some external folk and helping us with that. And then legal risks, I think I referred to the point which we really talked about in legal risks, which was around how we make sure that we've got efficiency and that we're in the processes there. Happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Before opening it up, Malta, you might like just to get a message to Pete and Andrew that for once we're running slightly ahead of time rather than behind time, which will shock them. But it would be good if they're around to come in. Just on that pension point, I mean, what you said at the end is the really important issue, isn't it? That the liabilities ultimately are the department's, not ours, to the extent that there are liabilities.
The liabilities are ours. DH has given us an undertaking that they will meet those liabilities.
You're right, thank you. Kate, do you want to add anything?
It was just that we've spoken to DH and we're seeking clarity on the guarantee was about the liability, that they would cover anything that came through, but the cessation charges aren't explicitly mentioned in that, so we just need to make sure that they're covered.
Good.
Just to be clear, we have had support on the Teesside scheme. We had a letter from them very recently, just reconfirming their standing behind that. So there's no reason to suggest that DH wouldn't.
No, I perish the thought that they wouldn't honour their guarantee. Robert, you want to say something? Sorry, you looked as if you didn't.
No, it's actually a similar point I was going to raise, but that's fine.
Okay. Anybody else? Right, so we have an interesting pause while not only is Malta he's not in the room either, so unless you want to do this all on your own, Helen, we might wait at least until Malta comes back. Penalties for running ahead of time. For the board, not the members of the public, but for the board, was there any other business that anybody was going to raise under the any other business section? So we've knocked that on the head. I don't think we've ever been in this position where we're ahead of time. We spend most of our life being behind time. So we just have to talk amongst ourselves until Malta comes back in the room. We were nearly sending others out to look for you, Malta, but no. We just completely shocked you by being ahead of time rather than behind. I know. So anyway, you're very welcome, Pete and Andrew. Malta, are you introducing this, or is it straight to Pete? Pete, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, so thank you for inviting us back for this session. Really, this is laying out the top-level strategic objectives that we're trying to achieve that are digitally enabled but business-led, so that we can affect change in the CQC to become more efficient and more effective. We've laid these out. So since we had the private session in September and since we had another conversation this morning, we have grouped the business change into 4 areas of impact. Making CQC a better judge of quality and safety, making CQC easier to work with, making it easier for our staff to do their jobs, and making sure people understand our information. So fundamentally, changing that relationship slightly with those we work with and those who work here. That breaks down further into 6 priority programs of work whereby we'll affect those changes from a more technical perspective. So new information collection services, the benefits there are around only asking for information that we don't already hold, making it easy for people to supply the information that we need, reducing burden in the system and making those processes more effective. Registration transformation. Registration is the core of everything we do. It is it creates the master record on which many of our other services lie, and registration is an essential part of making sure services are fit for purpose in the initial stages. So that is a critical program. New evidence collection, so making sure that our inspectors are efficient and effective when they're out, making sure that we can capture information digitally at first step rather than on paper, thinking more further forward in terms of capturing things like pictures or video or any of those other pieces that may sit behind effective evidence collection, and that will be an important part of the programme. Then report authoring and information publication. So in that space, it's both the more reports as you might conceive them today. So how do we make sure that inspectors can create reports in a faster turnaround time containing the right information, but also it's about how do we present the right information to the right audience at the right time in the right way. So context-sensitive information, making sure it's presented for the people that are going to use it in the way that's best appropriate for them to consume it. So that's an important part. Becoming intelligence-led, or extending that, so making sure that we are using the right information to inform risk, to manage our inspections, to manage the scheduling, to highlight areas of concern, and to do that in a faster turnaround than a regular cyclical basis. So intelligence-led is critical. And then we have some core service design pieces about the technology that underpins the organisation, the way that we need to move to different devices and fundamentally change the way that our people operate with equipment they would expect if they were buying it themselves at home. So those are the core priority areas. We've taken a bottom-up approach to developing a plan towards this, and the plan we put forward is intentionally aggressive, shall we say, in terms of trying to do everything at once. Not to say that we will do everything at once, but to make sure we force the conversation about where will the core benefits lie, which pieces will make the most impact early, how do we chunk those programs down to a deliverable plan that we can all believe in over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's the conversation that we're working through at the moment to turn from the strategic intentions to the deliverable plan, and that's the work to happen next. Those are the core points, really, and then the steer for the board is the appetite for that change, the prioritisation of that change, and the way in which we structure and implement that through joint working effectively across all directorates, because it is a cultural change and a new way of working, not simply a technology change. So it needs to be led jointly and managed effectively and coordinated well. So those, I think, are the core pieces.
Thanks, Pete, and that's it's a really helpful paper, and we've come a long way, I think, in the last few months. So thank you and the team. But as you rightly say, this poses a lot of questions, and as well as I say, moving us forward. So, I don't know, Jory, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think there's a lot of good work that's gone into this paper, having had conversations with Andrew, Pete and Helen, and I think it's a tremendous amount of collaboration throughout the organisation to get this paper done. But just to frame, just to frame the conversation and use my weekend hobby of looking at housing estates, I think the pace that you're going to move at is ambitious, and the disruption on the wider CQC organisation is going to be large, because this is not just a technology project, it's a digital project, and by its very nature, digital involves representatives of all parts of the business. So if we take the housing estate analogy, where house builders have two options. They can either lay down the foundations of a large new estate and then build all the houses and then realise the benefits when the last house is built and the new occupants move in. Or there's a new approach that house builders are using, and because house builders are often dependent on cash flow, they would build a phase of the housing. They would move in people into those houses. They would realise the benefits through cash flow, which would allow them to build the next phase of the housing. And I think the approach we've got here is two opposing factors. Is, do we take, to your point, Pete, do we take one set? It could be registration. It could be how inspectors use mobile first. Do we take one set of that and say, we'll complete this work? At the same time, we have to do all the underlying work of improving our data collection, normalising our data, and putting data science at it. But we actually realise the benefits a lot earlier, rather than trying to do everything, which will disrupt the organisation hugely in 1 year, and then really realise our benefits truly in the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, my preference would be, and the reason for the preference is, I think once you've built something early on, you also create a feedback loop. And through that feedback loop, you start learning lessons. Now, that may cause you to pivot your strategy in years 3 to 4. And you may say, although intelligence is really important to us, I'm just using this as an example, although intelligence is really important in data science, machine learning were the areas we're going to go to, right now we've decided to pivot more on the inspectors, because we think there's a greater benefit through that feedback loop that we've received, having built something for the inspectors. So what I'd like to see is a sort of slight flip of this recommendation to really look at it from a business impact perspective. And then once we've realised the business impacts, then we start underlying the technology changes to require that. Some of those may be wide and some of those might be narrow. That would involve a lot of the organisation coming together to help us do that. And the resultant paper would be a combined, call it business because I come from the private sector, so it could be combined sort of from the inspectorates, from our staff, from our finance folks, and from our intelligence and digital people. So it'd be a joint written paper. That may take us a bit longer to do, but I think the benefits of that would be greater.
So to stretch your housing estate analogy probably too far, I mean, actually, a house builder will arrive at the end point, which is the last person moving into the last built house, at about the same time under either approach. It's just that there are people that are in houses much earlier. So I don't see this necessarily as being, as I say, I'm slightly overusing your analogy, but I personally didn't see this as necessarily pushing back the whole programme. It's phasing it in a completely different way and getting some of the benefits much earlier. That's how I read it. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, to really stretch the analogy, it may be that, when the people have moved into the initial houses, they find all sorts of defects. It could be the taps aren't working or something. And the important thing for this strategy is, what we want to do in the strategy is remove risk as early as possible. With a lot of traditional approaches of technology projects, the risk keeps moving further and further down, and you only see the risk when you're actually doing the testing right at the end. And what I'm proposing, and I think Pete, Helen and Andrew are also aligned, is that we recognise a lot of the risks earlier on, and then we start mitigating them. And although it will look slower at the beginning, the velocity will increase towards the end, because we'll have realised and learnt a lot of lessons early on, and we'll apply those lessons to the remaining houses. So it will slow us down. I think in the first year it probably will slow us down. But in subsequent years I would expect to see an increase in the velocity and the capability of the team to deliver what they need to. There's some things that still will have to happen on a more enterprise side. Maybe that's part of the intelligence side where we are still collecting and normalizing that data. So I think there's some things that we will still do on a large scale, but we'll put those on one side, and there's a lot of the digital efforts that will happen at a lot faster pace.
Paul.
I'm going to extend it even further, the analogy around this, because I think it's the right way to look at it. Because there's a piece of work which we also need to do right up front, which is about actually making sure that, if you like, the basic groundwork is done and the utilities are put in, such that you can then build the houses in the places you want to build them afterwards. And I think that's an important bit that you get right, because you can't go back in after you've built all the houses and put new mains and things in easily. Equally, at the same time, you've got to make sure that if you're connecting new mains or whatever, or new roads, that you aren't stopping people getting into the rest of your housing estate where they're still living and working, essentially. So we need to make sure that we're maintaining what we're doing elsewhere while we're developing the new stuff. So I think some important points in getting the thinking behind that absolutely right early on, because it becomes hugely expensive if we get that wrong. And that we have the resources enabled to be able to integrate things as they come, as the new houses come on board, as you're getting the building works going. You can integrate stuff into your footprint, if you like, into your base effectively, and you don't end up with a problem of actually how do you actually put everything together at the end of the day. And that systems integration bit is a hugely important bit, which we need to make sure we've got the capability to do, as well as the right tools to do it with.
Yes, so I would basically agree with all of those points. So I think Gio is absolutely right about the agile approach to development and the fact that we need to really understand the early benefits and deliver some of those early. And the feedback loop is critical here. And the feedback loop is what will also generate the internal pull from the inspectors as well, because that will understand the degree to which we are making their lives easier and better, and the way that is impacting others as well, and what doesn't work, so we don't replicate it 3,000 times, and we test it and improve it and roll it out, and that's absolutely critical. I think the integration point is important as well, but that's about transition planning for me. So there are some services where we're reliant quite heavily at the moment. So, for example, CRM is very heavily embedded for many of our operational processes. And rather than taking a big bang approach to swapping that for something else that we don't fully understand, it's going to be about carefully planning how we change processes. So what do we do with registration to pull things out of the current CRM service to deliver a better answer to people, by way of example? And how do we make sure that new services integrate back into often old views of the world, so particularly from we're looking at the intelligence side of things, where we're aggregating information from all over the system, we need to make sure I can see new and old next to each other in a completely reliable and consistent fashion that feeds everything else we do. So I agree with all of those points. And it is about, for me, that collective benefits ownership in terms of why are we doing this? That's the first group. Why are we doing this in the first place? And how do we make sure we measure against that why early and often, rather than at the end of a long programme?
If I can move on from the building site analogy, I totally support the fact that what we do must be something we can practically deliver, and that's absolutely clear. But we mustn't, in the process of looking at the practicalities, lose sight of the ambition here. And I think what I see here is really a very ambitious programme, which I think is necessary and we should aspire to deliver. And we need to decide how practically to do that as quickly as possible, but clearly as quickly as possible, because I think it will make a real difference to the quality of our regulation. It will make a real difference to our productivity as a regulator. And I think something that we shouldn't forget is if we do this well, it will reduce the burden on the providers we regulate. And I think that really is very important, that we need to understand the effect we have on providers, and we ask for lots of information from them. And if we can develop a digital approach that will extract that information without creating burden for them, I think that will be extraordinarily well welcomed by the system. So I think there's real opportunities here, both for us in terms of the way we work, but also in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of our regulation externally.
Yeah, thank you, Jane.
Thank you. It's really good to hear Ted talking about it. I would almost suggest at our next presentation that it's the chief inspectors that talk about the digital programme, because that really brings over the reality. Pete Peter talks a wonderful talk, and I almost understand it, the digital side of it, but it'd be great to hear the Chief Inspectors talking about it next time. But at the same time, I wouldn't want that then to turn into some sort of a silo thing, because we need to have a digital programme that works across the whole organisation. But my question is, we're doing all this for the end user, which is the man and woman in the street, people like us. What are you going to do to involve people who will be the end users of the CQC product in making sure that our digital offering works for them?
So I think this is partly about how we do business and how we work, because there's a clear historical gap in terms of what you'd call product management, user research, those aspects of digital development. And we need to fill that quite quickly so that we are in a position to fully take on board the views of those who will be using the services. I think the conversation so far has focused on the narrower set of users in terms of our staff and those in providers providing information, for example. There's a whole... The fourth point I made about improving this is making sure others understand our information, and that's probably the place we would start with that function. So this is about how do we rethink the way we communicate with people, not just by putting PDFs on a website and hoping that they can read 80 pages and interpret it, and actually understanding that they want to know something for a reason. Perhaps they have a relative and are looking for a care home. How are they going to make that decision, and what are we going to do to help that decision in a constructive manner? And that does come back to understanding them as people and not them in the abstract, and that is about engagement and proper conversations and user testing and feedback and all of those things that Jura was talking about, but with a different and wider set of audience.
Yes, sorry, Andrew. I was just going to say to Jane, I mean, just to give notice, I was actually going to bring the Chief Inspectors in, because there is a point that you made, Pete, right at the front, and Jura repeated, which is this has got to be led by the user need, and the primary user is our inspection people. So I was just going to ask the Chief Inspectors to comment on how they think our own people are engaged in this. So to give notice of that, but let me go to Andrew, who was going to say something completely different, I suspect.
No, I was going to take the opportunity that I was implicitly being invited to by Jane, and to kind of tie both aspects of your question together, which is, in some senses, we shouldn't be talking about this as a digital transformation project. We should be talking about this as changing the way that we do what we do and making sure that it's more effective, it's more efficient, and that it has better outcomes for our staff, for the people that we're working with in the sectors, but absolutely for people who are using services and using our information to inform their decision making. So I think that it does come to the point of, well, how engaged are Chief Inspectors, senior leadership teams and the registration and inspection staff in the process. And from two areas where we have, within my directorate, been very directly involved. The first has been on the adult social care provider information return, looking to make that a digital platform so that providers can engage with that. And yes, we would be expecting them to update that on an annual basis, but what we want to do with the digital way of doing this is make this as useful for them in terms of being the vehicle by which they can manage their own quality assurance processes, update when they've got the information, to tell us where they've improved services, and to tell us of changes in their services which can inform our inspection kind of focus as well as timing. And that has been, one of the first projects that we've been getting into, where there's been that to and froing between Pete's team, the intelligence team, but also members of my team, in understanding what questions do we want to ask, how do we want to ask them, how does that manifest itself in terms of the mechanism by which they're asked, and how does that then feed into the information that inspectors get so that they can use it in an intelligent and informed way. And this hasn't been me that's been doing it, but I have now seen some of the end product of it, and it's great. We had a really good demonstration a few weeks ago, and I was saying, oh, could it do this and could it do that? And actually the answer was yes, which is not normally the answer that I get when I ask whether things can happen from a technology point of view. So it was very, very encouraging. But the reason why that was happening was because we had a lot of engagement across both teams. And the second area that we're looking at this is around registration. And we're at the starting point on registration, it's fair to say. But I think that one of the things that I am very conscious of is that we've put an awful lot of investment, if you like, in terms of expecting the digital work to really help us with the transformation. And that is the way that we have to look at it. We're trying to improve what we're doing in registration overall, and digital helps us do that. It helps us to have a better way of providing information externally, and it also helps us internally. And so not to see it as it's Pete's job to get registration transformation right. It's actually my job, and I'm going to hold him to account for helping me to do it. And it's that way round rather than vice versa.
Thanks. Ted, do you want to sort of add where you and your directorate are?
Well, just to answer your question, Peter, I think there's no doubt that our frontline staff, the inspectors and the other frontline staff, are very keen to see digital solutions to some of the problems they have in terms of their day-to-day workload, and they will be the first to cry out for that. And so we need to answer that question for them, and part of that has to be to get them fully engaged in the solutions. But it isn't just asking them how can they do what they do now better with digital. It's about actually asking what can they do differently, and I think that's the real challenge. It isn't just getting them to lead the process, it's actually engaging them in the process, and if you like, opening up the possibilities of how we can inspect in different ways, regulate in different ways, seek information from trusts and communicate with them in different ways. And I think that's a really exciting thing here. And this plan, as laid out in the paper, I think does get a nice balance between how do we deal with some of our current IT problems and make them easier to work with, but equally, how do we open up the possibilities of doing things very differently? And I strongly supported that. But where I've introduced IT solutions before in trusts, the key thing that you've got to get right is that frontline engagement. You can't just impose an IT solution on people. They will just find ways of working around it if they're not involved in developing the way of doing it.
Yeah, that's a really strong point. Steve?
So thank you, and I welcome Pete's appointment here because we're now seeing a bit of energy and action on something which I've been talking about since I was appointed. This is actually about how we work differently. It should, for PMS across our different areas, help us with monitoring providers and the risk management, so that we inspect when we need to rather than just doing things because it's on a rota. My experience in other organisations and with friends leading this sort of work that Pete's leading is if you're not ambitious, you end up with a series of bolt-ons which cause problems and then eddy currents in the system, and eventually you have to spend more money. So my encouragement has been all along to be ambitious and to look at how we work differently. And the key people for me are the inspectors and the inspection managers who monitor portfolios of providers, all of which are changing as we speak. Number of, for example, in one small part of what I do, general practice, the numbers have decreased over the last 6 months. It could be they dramatically reduce as providers get larger and more complex, so we have to be agile. As far as it directly affecting us is that we've got this thing called the digital PIC, which is about information, which looks as though we'll be at alpha testing in March 2018. We won't really be able to change what we're doing on the ground to probably the end of next year, October, according to this paper. That means workforce implications for us, because we were planning to look at how we can change what we're doing based on the digital offer. The longer that takes, the more staff we need, and the higher the budget in a way, because it'll be about how we do things very differently. So we need to be ambitious and quick with this, because the longer we take, the less likely we are to be able to rationalise what we're doing and move to the monitor function as well as I would like.
So, Pete, I think when Steve says he's seeing a bit of energy, you should take that as a compliment. Slightly.
That's a big compliment for me, so that's good. Yeah, it's been great. I mean, Peter's been, and the team, Andrew and co, their communication has been excellent, and it's what we've needed for some time. And I congratulate them on what they've done so far.
I just think what you meant to say was a lot of energy rather than a bit of energy. Anyway, so,
I'm
Helen,
a long-term Albion fan. My expectations are always low in life.
Helen, you've been sitting very quietly. I mean, I see what you're doing as being separate from, but also part of. So I'd be really interested just to get your thoughts on where you are and the aspects in this paper that relate to your bit of the business.
Sure. Excuse me. So there's a clear priority around enabling intelligence and the work that the digital team will do to support putting the right platforms and frameworks in place to enable us to do the work that we need to do, the ambition we have around being more targeted in our inspection efforts and some of the work that Steve and others have described. But equally, there's lots of things in this plan that will impact us indirectly as well. So we're working really closely with Pete and team on what all those pieces are. So registration, while there's a registration programme, actually, the information that comes out of that will absolutely help us improve all of the work that we do around intelligence. So while there's a clear enabling intelligence priority, all of the other components will add up to enabling us within the intelligence team to do better, quicker, more quality work that can support the work of the organisation. The point around the house building, and I know we don't want to go there any further, but one of the pieces that we're doing quite quickly and we're trying to speed up between the work that we're doing is putting that platforms in place. It's some of that pipe work to make sure that we've got all of our data in one place that makes it easier and faster for us to deliver outputs to the rest of the organisation so that we can make more timely, more consistent decisions. So for us, there is a piece around getting that pipe work and the plumbing done as quickly as we can to allow us to have a platform to build from. That's not to say we're not going to continue doing some of the data science work and other pieces that we're exploring in the meantime, but our focus has to be the base work to get us to a place where we can support all of the parts of the organisation more effectively.
Good, thank you. David.
Thanks. So to try and draw some of this together, I think what we've got in this report is probably the clearest statement we've had ever of what our priorities are. So I think the work that the team have done has really borne that fruit. And I think what the board are invited to do today is just confirm back to the team, Peter, Andrew and Helen, that these are the priorities we want to go forward on. I think the next stage, picking up on Jura's contribution, and I think what Paul was saying as well, is to begin to convert this statement of priorities into what are the deliverables for the rest of this year and what are the resources which are required to deliver that. And resources are people resources, people with the skills to do some of this next work. We've got some of that, but we'll have to procure some of it as well. But it's perhaps some of the resources that are flagged in here that are required to take this forward, which isn't about people, it'll be about the additional assistance we require as well. Our potential to do that will work out financially, and that's where one of the contributions from this conversation is about how we can see this as a one CQC project, not a digital project which is for the digital team, but is for the whole organisation to take forward. And we'll do that, and there are opportunities. We had the financial performance report earlier on this agenda that gives us some sense of what those opportunities are to take this forward, as well as some of the investments that have been made. But they need hardening up, and I think there is a point in the last paragraph of the report which is about how we can use some phasing in opportunities. I think Peter was referring to that in his introductory comments. to actually take that forward, but also how can we get the benefits out of this as well. So it's not just about what the investments are, but the benefits that we can take back. I think this is being signalled here that some of these benefits might not occur in 17-18 this year, and they might be harder to get out in 18-19, and they'll come after that. But having a clearer sense of what that is, because if we're going to make investments, we need to understand what benefit we're going to get back from it in terms of the advantages it will give to the organisation, to the people that work in the organisation, the people that will use our reports, and so on and so forth. So there's separate work going on within the organisation that colleagues here are involved in, which is developing our business plan for 18-19. So what will happen from here, Peter, and if you're prepared to confirm these priorities this afternoon, is that this work will now be taken into the business plan preparation, where we can begin to set specific costs against some of these. We're obviously not going to do that in a public session just yet, because there's a commercial issue here if we've got to procure just to so this isn't a black box, but this is a commercially sensitive area until we're ready to go, and we'll do that financial planning. So by the time we bring a business plan to the board in private session at the end of this calendar year, and then into public session in the spring of next year, the early 2018, what we'll be able to present to you is a costed programme which will show exactly what's going to be taken forward in 18-19, what some of the investments are, and if there are benefits in 18-19, what they are, but if those benefits accrue in 19-20, just being clearer about that. As we have to prepare business cases, we'll have to have some discussion with the DH. We need to be clear about these things, and there's no point in saying, oh, I didn't think you needed to get that. We know they'll ask for that, so we need to do the work now as part of that. So effectively what I'm saying, Peter, is that if the board are happy with the statements of priorities and ambition that we've got here, the next stage of this is to put a costed programme onto this. And part of that costed programme will not be just what is financially available to us. We can do the work on that, and as I say, I think we have some opportunities. But what, as an organisation, are we capable of delivering within 18-19? I think the point has been teased out in this conversation, that this isn't just about, can Pete and his team spec what these programmes are, get a procurement through Annette and Kate's team to get this in, but it is also about, we've referred to inspectors. Have we got the inspectors that are available to do the work on this, the design and development work? Can they do the testing? Once we've done the testing, can they do the feedback? So actually just accepting this is a whole organisation programme which will require the engagement of the whole organisation causes us to have, I think we'll need a really hard conversation. I don't mean difficult, we just need a realistic conversation about who's going to get freed up to do what over what time scale. Because we can have all the ambition to go quickly in the world, but if we don't have the people involved that need to be involved, it just won't fly. So I think that's the next stage of the work. So this period between now and I think there's reports coming in November and December. I think for the December report to the board is where the costing and the programme and project management will get set out. So personally, I'm very pleased with the work that the team have done. I think we're in a much better place as a consequence, and we now need just to push this into, turn it into a deliverable plan which has the money, the capability and the capacity set aside, and the capacity is going to be a whole organisation capacity, not just how many analysts do we need or how many people that can design software or whatever it happens to be. But I hope you can agree the priorities that are set out in the report this morning.
Robert.
So just a question, really. We take it that implied in what you just said, David, is that the order in which these priorities are started, delivered, whatever, has to some extent, in fact a very big extent, to be determined by the benefits as you've described, both financial and others, and how important. We want to do all this stuff, and we've got a period of time within which we want to do it. Some of it might turn out to having, on the analysis that you're suggesting, to be a bit more important than others. Is that part of your thinking?
Well, I'll let others come in on this, but I mean, broadly what we're saying is these are the priorities we want to take forward, and I think, just to the point, this isn't the executive teams or the senior management teams set the priorities. I mean, Peter carried out a pretty extensive consultation exercise right across the organisation, which involved all levels of staff. It didn't involve every single individual, but certainly the exec team sat in workshops where Pete ran us through a prioritisation exercise where, surprise, surprise, we had slightly different approaches to this, but the whole purpose of the exercise was to distill that down into a statement of priorities. So I think what the board have got in front of them this afternoon, to your question, Robert, is a clear statement of priorities which are presented to you by Peter and the team, but as endorsed by the executive team. And certainly, as Chief Executive, my invitation for you to agree these priorities is because all that work sits behind it. It's not, we've not just got to it. I think the issue of capacity, and that's money and people, is really going to be the gearing of the speed at which we do these. It's not whether we do these. I think what we've got here is a statement of priorities. These are what we want to do. The issue is it time or money that regulates how quickly we can do some of these? I think there's also the point that Jura's making, and Peter also referred to, which is the way that we're doing this in the light of experience of how we do some of these first buildings on the building site. We might actually flex the design on some of the second buildings. I can't keep the metaphor running, but it might be instead of having wood cladding, we go for tile. I live in Tunbridge Wells, so we have tile cladding on the buildings in the light of that experience. So I think there is a bit about this will be an iterative process, but we can't keep spinning around this vortex of not being clear about what our priorities are and not having a delivery plan because we can't cost it, get the benefits out or identify. And what this does is it breaks through, I think, the circle that we've been in over the past 2 to 3 years, saying we know we need to do this, but what is it we do and what do we do first? And I think what we've got here is a very clear statement of what we do first. I think what we now need to do is cost it. That's money, but also the capability we need, the people skills that we need to deliver this. We've got some of those skills, but we haven't got all of those skills, so we're going to have to bring them in. So I think the stage we're in now is to go to that one, which is what skill do we need to deliver these? Can we then go out and procure them so we've got them available to us that will then help us to deliver the programme? And that's the more detailed costings that we need to get in place over the period. So I'm hoping we can deliver all of this. What we can't tell you at the minute is how much will it all cost and over what period of time we do that. And that's the work that will get done between now and December. So we should be back in a private session of the board in December into January saying you supported these priorities in October and the work we've done subsequently is this, and what we now know is this is what this will cost us and this is the skill that we need. We might not have all the clearances we need through DH, that will be another thing that we need to go through, but being clear about what we want to do is the first stage of this. And personally, I don't think we've been at this stage before of having the clarity that we've got. So I feel very confident about where we are, but we are at the beginning of this, not at the end of it.
So, David, I haven't heard anybody suggest these are not the right priorities, so unless anybody wants to say that now, I think you have board agreement that these are the priorities. I think there's been a lot of useful discussion around the next steps and the route map that we will follow to deliver all of the priorities. As you said, Robert, this is something we want to deliver in its entirety over time. So I think that's probably as far as we can go today, but a lot of work to be done over the next couple of months and to come back to the board. But thank you, all three of you and your teams behind you for getting us to this stage, because as David says, I think we're in a better place than certainly since I've been here we've been at. So great, thank you very much indeed. Eileen, this is your last board meeting. And I just want to say thank you so much for what you've done. I mean, we said earlier, you're sort of leaving us on a high in terms of the areas of your responsibility where the performance has been great. But what people don't necessarily see is the huge amount of support that you've certainly given to me since I've been here, which I really value, and the work that you do and have done, both sort of up front but also behind the scenes to deliver the organisation to where we need to be. So thank you. And I wish you every success. Well, we all do, but I wish you every success in your future career. And please keep in touch. We will miss you. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much, not all of you. Thank you very much indeed. And so all of us might like to say thank you, is what I was trying to say. Right, so I need to tell everybody we have a very hard finish at 12:40 because board, you need to be in the, let's get this right, in the orange area, which is the bit behind the reception at 12:45. So your duties don't finish when the board meeting comes to an end, just in case you thought they did. So that's the orange area, which is the orange quadrant, to give it its proper title, which is behind the reception, which leaves us only a few minutes for questions. So I've been notified of 2 in advance. I'm going to take those first, and I suspect that's all we'll have time for today. So, Robin, you were the first in to send a question. So, just for the record, Robin, if you can say who you are, and then ask a question, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Robin Pike, Hertfordshire Health Watch. Is a quick question on hospital inspections in relation to those larger hospitals which are often on multiple sites. So, for example, UCLH, which was one of the first hospitals to be inspected under the new system, has ENT in the Gray's Inn Road. It has neurology in Queen Square, and it has urology in Westmoreland Street. Now, I think each of these 3 departments is located in Victorian buildings, and if the hospital were to be inspected on 3 core services, whether this is comprehensive or focused, and those core services were all located in the new modern building, it would not give an accurate view of the whole hospital trust. So how are inspections for larger hospitals planned?
Ted. Thank you very much. Well, we've inspected UCLH twice, actually. And in the second time, we did go to Western Street. So just to reassure you, we have those areas in our sites, and we will go and inspect any area where we believe there is a risk and a need for us to look at. In very big hospitals, we obviously can't go into every ward in every building. They're just too big for us to do that, and it would take too long. So it is very much a risk-assessed basis. And we do look at the estate risk. So you mentioned Victorian hospitals, and it's not just about Victorian hospitals, often which were very well built in their time, but are outdated. And I think what we challenge hospitals to is not how old is your building, but are you using it effectively, and have you adapted it, and are you maintaining it effectively for the benefit of patients? And if you look at our reports, we've been very critical of some hospitals and taken action against them where they have old buildings, not all Victorian, but old buildings, they haven't maintained to a satisfactory standard, they haven't adapted for the needs of modern of modern medicine and the current patient population, and we've told them to take action, and there's been some significant improvements in those buildings. I think we do look at every hospital comprehensively across the board and take an assessment of where the risks lie in that organisation, and that's based on the data. We've just been talking about how we look at data, and we want to improve that, but it's also based very much on what patients tell us about their experiences, and we talked about patient surveys earlier on, and what staff tell us. And I think if we hear that there are problems in a particular area because of the estate, we will go in and have a look at that area regardless of the clinical service. So our core clinical services now allow us to go and look anywhere in terms of where we perceive there may be risk. So when we next look at UCLH, I won't predict where we'll go because it will be unannounced, or all our inspections are unannounced now. We will look at the risk of the whole institution and decide where we want to focus.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Jade, welcome back, and you kindly notified of a question, so you get the second go. Microphone, please, and Jade, please say who you are.
Yes, I'm Jade Taylor, and I'm here in a personal capacity in my own time. I have a day off today. Really want to keep the house building metaphor going because it it made my heart sing having once built a house. And I must say, in terms of the fact that you want to progress this very quickly, when I was building a house, I had a slight hiccup because I had to spend £30,000 more on building the foundations 10 metres deeper than they needed to be. The house is, I believe, still standing. The house further up the hillside, I watched on a Sunday afternoon slide down. just a warning. But anyway, my question is... I'll go on to my substantive question, but this is with regard to an article which was in the Mail on Sunday on the 3rd of September this year. And it was talking about disturbing parallels with the mid-staff scandal. And it was an article by Professor Brian Jarman. And I'll just read out something at the bottom very quickly. 10 years ago, Professor Sir Brian Jarman sent a series of mortality alerts to health bosses about what was then a little-known part of the NHS in the middle of England. Its name, Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust. He and his colleagues at the Dr. Foster Intelligence Unit were concerned that death rates at mid-staffs, as it became known, were considerably higher than average. How much higher? About 27%. When we published that, the Department of Health insisted that people take no notice of our data. Professor Jarman recalled last week, we asked them why not, but we never got a proper explanation. But he and his team were onto something big. And soon afterwards, personal reports of the shocking care that patients at Stafford Hospital had received started emerging. Adding to the death rate data, the reports led an investigation by the Healthcare Commission, the watchdog at the time. Its report and subsequent official inquiries revealed a culture pervading all levels of the health service, where criticism of the NHS was ignored or suppressed with lethal consequences. This article, in which Professor Jarman raises serious concerns, was pointing out that it is wrong that NHS Digital suppresses the fact that for 2/3 of trusts with significantly high SHMI values, the fact that they were significantly high is not highlighted. One consequence of this is that CQC concludes for those trusts that there is no problem with mortality, even if CQC have found very poor care. So moving back to my substantive question that I sent to you a couple of months ago, why does the NHS keep making the same mistakes over and over again? And will the CQC please debate this in the next session as a matter of urgency on behalf of patients and provide a substantive response to the public, either through a press release or at the next board meeting?
So, Jade, if we hadn't run out of time, I would have invited Ted in particular, the three chief inspectors, to comment. But I would hope if Bram was sitting in this room now, he would not have the worry that he's allegedly said to have had in that newspaper cutting. We've just spent most of the morning talking about how we use intelligence. we are well aware of all the data, and certainly, Ted, you will be well aware of the SME data and any other relevant data when you risk assess hospitals. So I think we are way ahead of where we were 10 years ago, and are moving further ahead. And I personally don't see whatever NHS Digital doing, and we work very well with NHS Digital, I don't think that whatever they're doing, and I don't know what they do with the data, has been relevant in the sense because we actually have it. So I would go away very reassured, and I would hope that Bram would if he were here.
Thank you. Could I ask that you perhaps read the report and speak to Professor Jarman, because I'm not so reassured that he is reassured, perhaps, with what's been
I can't stop you talking to Bram Jarman if you
no,
wish,
I said,
wish to.
Will you speak to Professor Jarman?
Probably not, but
Okay.
possibly. So we've really got to bring it to an end because the board is required elsewhere. But Ted, did you want to say something? 30 seconds?
Well, I mean, I've been more than happy to speak to Professor Jarman.
Thank you.
That's not a problem. Just to reassure you briefly, because it's a big subject and I can't cover it all in just a few minutes. But we look regularly at mortality data across a range of mortality data for all NHS trusts, and we will be in contact with them if we see any outliers at all. It isn't just SHIMI. SHIMI is just one element of data. We look at a whole range of other data. And we certainly look at SHIMI, but there's a whole host of other data out there which we monitor continuously. And if any trust has an outlier for mortality for any particular condition, we will contact the trust and ask them to investigate and look very carefully at their investigation of it. And if we're not happy, we will inspect them, and we have done. So there, there isn't a sense that we're ignoring mortality data, but actually mortality data is a lot more than just the SHIMI data.
It's complex, and I do suggest you speak with him. I'm not reassured. I'm
So
sorry.
you may not be reassured. I'm very reassured by what we're doing, Ted. Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry, but we do have to bring this to an end because, board, you are required, wherever I said you were required, but the other side of reception now, straight away, please. Thank you.